Okay, hi everyone. This is the second part of our lecture on myths from literature to archaeology. In this lecture, I'm going to talk about some of the archaeology that we have from the city of Rome. So there are a number of dates on here, and again, it's not important to be memorizing. You don't need to know when the glacial phase 3 is, but it is important to understand that these are separate phases. So as you're reading through some of the literature, they might talk about glacial phase 4A, and then I've given you the dates here. This is a really interesting time period for archaeology because, and I'll show you a map here in just a second of the quote, seven hills of Rome and the Tiber. But what you find is that the earliest archaeology from, say, glacial phase 1, about 1,000 to 900 BC, is between 20 and 25 feet below the modern day surface. So that's quite far down you have to dig. And the reason for that is partly this. So this map is showing you some of the hills of Rome. And as you can see here, let me get my little pen here. So this is the Tiber. This is the river Tiber that flows by Rome. As it's flowing down, it's bringing lots of silt, and it's bringing over centuries, it raises up the ground. Now, we also have people building there and moving massive amounts of material around. And that's also kind of filling up the area. But that's one of the reasons why it's the early phase is found so deep. And so what can archaeology tell us from the glacial phase 1, which is 1,000 to 900 BC? We know, and it really depends on who you read, we know that people have been living in this area probably, I mean, one archaeologist thinks it goes back to 1400 BC, but at least by 900 BC, you've got people living in this area. Now, they're living on the hills because, as I just mentioned, you've got the Tiber River right here. The whole area around these hills was very marshy, and it caused lots of sickness and so on, and people tended to avoid those areas naturally and would live in the hills. But we know that people were living there that early. Um, in this period, we find evidence of human occupation, especially in terms of burial sites. So at this early period, people didn't bury bodies. What they did was they cremated them. So uh, someone died, they would gather up wood, they would burn the body, they would gather the ashes, and what they would do is they would bury them usually in these urns, and I'll show you an example of one of those in just a second. We do have grave goods, so they would put the urn where they wanted to bury the person's remains, and sometimes they would put little objects there. So these are called grave goods. So anything in a grave that's not the body is called a grave good, and that can include the urn itself. And there's something called seriation, and this was really developed highly in Egyptian archaeology, where you can look at specific types of, say, pottery, and that a specific type was built or was made at a certain time, certain decoration, and then you can date the layer if you can date that piece of pottery. And then what normally happens is not all the pottery is going to be in the exact same layer, say 20 feet down. You're going to find some pottery in another layer. But if it's the same type as this one, then you can do the dating, and that's called seriation. So what can this tell us about Roman civilization at this point? Well, not too much, except there are clearly people there. They are taking care of their dead. They're making pottery, or they're bringing in pottery. A lot of times this is Etruscan pottery from we talked about the Etruscans last week. So there might be some type of trade going on. It's really hard to tell this early. And here's an example of what's called a hut urn. So it looks like a house, probably what a house used to look like. This is from the Latial or Latium, depending on who you read, phase 2A. And you can see that it's made out of ceramic and so on. And what they would do is they would put the ashes of the person in the hole there, and then they would have a little cover. Then we move on to the glacial phase two, and I've given you the dates here. And this is when you can really start finding some interesting things. So there are more grave sites, and what that usually tells us is that the population is growing. Um, you also have the number of grave goods going up, which is really interesting. And I've got this question down at the bottom. What do these changes suggest? I'm going to kind of talk about these at the same time. So when your grave goods go up, that usually is telling you something about the economy. So you wouldn't normally put something in a grave that you would need to live. It's an extra item like a knife or a sword or a part of a spindle that's used to make clothing and so on. These are extra things that can go in. So it's telling you a little bit about the economy, the social structure, and so on. The settlements are getting bigger. So, and that goes along with more grave sites. So there's more people living in this area, there's more people dying, and there's more people that need to be buried. Pottery decoration is changing. You find more pottery with more decoration. And this is kind of interesting too, because to for people to make pottery, it means you probably have agriculture and there's enough food to go around that someone can really have what you might call a job making pottery. And then they have more time to do that, and then they have more decoration. It could be that people want more decoration. You start to find this interesting transition between uh, cremation burials and what's called inhumation, where they bury the body. You start to find these. And you also start to see, I mentioned up above, more grave goods. Some of these become more expensive grave goods, like one had gold jewelry. You start to find more warlike material in there. And that's telling you, again, about the economy. It's telling you about the social structure. So now you have people that were probably wealthy when they were alive, and then they're buried with more wealthy materials, say, than the poorer people. Now, it's also interesting that you've got an area um, where these hills are that seems to be a centralized area, which we now call the Forum. People were buried there, but now they're buried further out. And so that's just telling you a little bit about the society and their ideas of not wanting to live very close to bodies that are being buried, so they move them out. And again, I've got this question here. What do they suggest? I've kind of gone over some of that in that previous slide. This is an interesting bit of archaeology. People call it the House of Romulus. Whether it is or not, I don't know, but it does date to around 800 to 750 BC. And if you remember, the traditional date of this is the founding of Rome is 753 BC. So it'd be really interesting to hope that this was the House of Romulus, but it's really unclear. Okay, when you move into glacial phase 3 and glacial phase 4A, so these are divided up. So you've got 4A, 4B, 4C, and so on. You start to find different types of pottery showing up in the archaeology, and some of the remains are Greek pottery. Now, I talked about this in a lecture previously about how the Greeks had left their homeland and they started to colonize some of the areas in southern Italy. So it's not a real big surprise that you start to find Greek pottery in Roman burials. Now, what it could be an indication of is trade, or it could be an indication of people just moving northwards who were Greek and they moved to this particular area and then mix with the Roman culture. It's also interesting that archaeology is showing that there's some type of wall that was put up in the 700 BC. And again, think about the story of Romulus, the kind of myth of Romulus and Remus building walls and how Remus was killed, and at the founding of the date is 753. This defensive wall kind of corresponds to that time period. And then you also see, just like I mentioned before, expensive material found in grave sites. And again, that can tell you a little bit about sociology of the people and the economy of this period. But you start to find that as the 600s as you get down to the later part of the 600s, these become rare. So early on, you see a lot of grave sites with grave goods, and then in the 600s, these start to become rarer, and you really have to wonder what is going on in this society. So part of what's happening is that they are spending their time and wealth doing other things. Now, the other reason why, probably part of the reason why you see fewer grave sites during this period is because Rome, remember I told you it's 25 to 20 foot deep. There is massive building and rebuilding and tearing down buildings and so on. And so it could be that there were more graves, but they've just been disrupted by all of the building. But more than likely what's happening is that you find much greater wealth happening in the 600s and the late 500s BC, according to archaeology. So what's really interesting, and I mentioned, that the Tiber River is flowing very close to there. It makes a lot of the areas in between these hills very marshy. The Romans during this period, the 600s, late 500s BC, decided to fill in a big chunk of this area, and this is what we call the Forum. It's kind of an area where people could gather. And I've given you a number here. It's been estimated between 10 and 20,000 cubic meters. That can be up to like 2,600 dump trucks of soil. Now, they didn't have dump trucks back there. This is a massive undertaking. And not only do you want to think about what it took for someone to say, hey, let's fill this in, but you need people to do that. And it's not a small population that can do something like that. And who's going to do it if you have a large population? So we're talking about the beginning of Roman society and organization and maybe following a leader. This is really the time period when, at least according to the literature, they have kings. So maybe they're following what the king said. Anyway, they fill in the Forum, they raise it up, and then it's paved so that more people could stand there, more people could gather, and so on. And we know that during this time, there's areas, and this kind of came up in the story of Romulus and Remus, which I didn't really talk about, but the Greeks would, when they landed at a certain spot that they wanted to live, they would mark out certain areas for the religion and for politics and so on. And they would separate these out. We think during this period that these were marked out to be separate from other areas. When you do the archaeology under the Forum, and I'll show you some archaeology here towards the end of the slides, there's things called votives, and these are things that people would give to the gods. So they would bring a statue of whoever, Minerva, and say, please help me with this. And then they would put the votive or the statue or the coin or whatever it is in a specific area. And so these start filling up with all these, and then you get the Forum paved over, and then people do archaeology, and you find large numbers of these, and that's telling you about religion. So you've got different things happening. The population is growing, they're building their Forum, they're marking out their political areas and religious areas. Religion is clearly becoming more popular because you find these votive deposits. Now, another thing that they also do, so remember the Tiber, and remember that it's a marshy area. They create a sewer system called the Cloaca Maxima. And this was done with the help of the Etruscans, at least archaeologists think. And so this is a massive sewer system that drains the water from where it collects, and then it moves it out to the Tiber. Pretty amazing structure if you think about it. And again, it was done with the help of the Etruscan engineers. Okay, and this is just showing you a little bit of how the track of the Cloa Maxima, or the sewer. You can see it here, and then it drains out. So it's collecting water from these areas and pushing it out into the Tiber. And then here's the opening of what it looks like today. Okay, so we're still talking about Rome in the late 600s, sorry, the 600s, the late 500s. You start to see stone houses for the first time. So before they were probably these hut type houses. I showed you that, the so-called hut of Romulus, where you can see kind of the post holes. Those are the holes there that were holding up probably wooden posts, and then you put a wooden top on it, and that's what people are living in. Starting in this period, you start to see stone houses. You start to see massive temples going up. So there's one called the Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. And I've given you here the dimensions. So it's 180 feet by 150 feet. This is a massive temple. Now, today we only have the foundations and part of what's called the podium. Um, but you can tell from that of the size. So this is a massive undertaking. Again, think about what that's telling you. So it's telling you about the economy. They had the wealth to do that. It's telling you about the society. They had people who could actually build this material. Uh, it might be talking about the politics. So during this period is still when, according to literature, you have kings. So there's some type of political organization that's being put together to build this. Now, I have to say, this photo is one I took. This is not the Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. I just wanted to put up a photo showing you a little bit more of the Roman Forum. So again, not the temple. And then you've got roads. The Romans are starting to build roads, and they were pretty good at that, which ultimately helps build their empire. Now, I had mentioned the forum and the paving of the forum. Um, in one area, they were doing some archaeology, and at some point, probably during the time of Julius Caesar, which is much, we haven't gotten to that point yet in the Republic, they put down some black marble, and archaeologists came along and they pulled the marble up, and they found that this pretty amazing inscription, and it's called the lapis niger. It's black stone. That's the black marble that's on top. They found votives in this area, plus an inscription. And I'm going to tell you right now, I've given you the inscription translation here. There is a huge amount of discussion about what this actually says. So as you look through this translation, you'll see these little parentheses. That's what people think it might say. So if you look at the first part, what's showing up that can be read is whosoever this, let him be cursed. So a translator thinks that what it really means is whosoever will violate this grove, let him be cursed. And then so think about that. Now, maybe as you read through it, concentrate on the places that don't have the parentheses. And so that's what we have left. Now, the most important thing about this is there is a word that is clearly saying king. So, we looked at the literature that talks about early kings of Rome. Now there's an inscription that dates to the mid 500s BC, when, according to literature, there were definitely kings. And now we've got an actual piece of archaeology that says the word king. So it's pretty clear that there were kings during this particular period. Okay, so I'm going to end this lecture now. Make sure you read this translation, and again, think about the parentheses and what it is. And if you have some time and you're interested, not important for our class, you can go find other translations of what this particular lapis niger piece of archaeology might say.